So what we'll do, yeah, thank you, excellent. So what we'll do is we'll present the 4 speakers. I think unless there's anything sort of point of clarification or anything, we'll save the questions until after the speakers, and then have a good session of kind of debate and discussion, Q&A. And then I'll ask the speakers to come back at the end and kind of summarise and answer anything that's been left unanswered. So hopefully that'll be reasonable and give people plenty of time to make a contribution. So without further ado then, let's go straight in and welcome Claire James, who is from Campaign Against Climate Change and one of the co-authors of the Climate Jobs booklet. So Claire, would you like to go ahead? I think you're going to share screen, yeah?
Yep, I will do so. Brief pause for me to sort that out. Hang on. Here we go. Right, that should be showing now. Shout if it's not. So on the subject of greenwash, I want to start with a presentation in order to draw out some of the themes that I keep on coming across when dealing with some quite different technologies and things that we might call greenwash. So I thought a useful way to start off, because I know that people in this meeting are going to have quite different levels of familiarity, is to just run through some of the jargon that's used, and often used as acronyms, and is one of the things that can be quite off-putting about this sort of thing. So first of all, CCS is carbon capture and storage, and we're talking here specifically about directly capturing the CO2 produced during burning fossil fuels in power stations, in industrial processes. And the idea is you can then lock it away underground for eternity. That's the idea. BECCS was bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And it's the same thing, but the theory is that you're burning bioenergy, it's carbon neutral. If you capture the carbon, it then goes carbon negative. You're going to hear a lot more about that. And another thing that's not talked about so much is the idea that when you capture the carbon, you might not store it away. You might actually use it. This might be something that's seemingly quite innocuous, like fizzy drinks with captured CO2 I've seen as an idea, but actually that's not, the CO2 is still going into the atmosphere when you open your can of Coke or whatever. And of all the CO2 that's been captured by CCS so far, the majority is actually being used to pump into oil fields to extract more oil. Now, this is not something that tends to get talked about an awful lot when this technology is being promoted. Another set of jargon is around hydrogen, which is given its own set of colours. So grey is the way that most hydrogen is made now, which is from combining fossil gas and steam. Some of it's made from coal. Those two together comprise almost all of the current hydrogen that is used today for things like fertilizer manufacture. The ones that get talked about a lot are blue hydrogen, which is the same as the above, but with carbon capture and storage, and green hydrogen, which is a totally different process and uses renewable energy. Final thing of jargon is net zero itself, and this is what the overarching concept, which underpinning concept of all of this stuff. And I've nicked this diagram off someone on Twitter. I saw it the other day. I thought it was really good, because why do we need net zero? Well, because it's really difficult to get everything down to zero. So you need something, be it reforestation or technological processes, you need something that then offsets those emissions. Now, in the theory of that is you just get down to teeny tiny and you only got a teeny tiny amount to offset, but it's used as a cover for the idea that we don't need to, we can carry on burning the fossil fuels, and then we rely massively on technologies that maybe don't exist, won't work, wouldn't work at scale. We know what works to cut emissions. We stop burning fossil fuels. We have to use less energy. We have to find clean alternatives. We stop chopping down forests, and we restore ecosystems which have been degraded. Now, each of those is complex, but these is basically what we need to do. However, this is not very these ideas are not popular with companies like BP, Shell, all the rest of it. They want to suggest solutions which are more profitable for them. So the alternatives they have are to keep burning fossil fuels, and well, I've picked up 4 things that they would suggest. One is just don't count the emissions, or don't count most of them, ignore it. The second is the idea that you can burn fossil fuels, pay someone else somewhere else to offset it. The third is you say that technologies or future technologies can take up all the CO2 you're emitting from burning fossil fuels. And all of this is backed up with an incredibly efficient greenwash machine around lobbying and PR. So I'm going to go through these quickly in turn. The first one is the creative accounting. You can ignore the climate impact of burning fossil fuels and only measure the emissions from extracting them. So oil companies like to do this. They ignore what are called their scope 3 emissions, which are from actually burning fossil fuels. And UK planning policy is also based on this. So this is the basis of approval of the West Cumbria coal mine. Recently, a really important case was heard in the Supreme Court about oil drilling at Horse Hill, and this would this asked that very question. You know, is it legal to have planning policy that ignores most emissions? One of the lawyers made a great point, which says, could you say that an unlit cigarette is not carcinogenic? I've just put a little note on this slide about another way in which our planning policy is completely dysfunctional. It's about if you can't reject something on the basis that it will increase emissions if the emissions from one project won't single-handedly wreck UK climate targets. The barrier is set really high to try and prevent councils from refusing polluting projects because of carbon emissions. And other things that can be ignored, the emissions from burning wood. Now, so we're going to hear more about DRACs, but one thing they do is they say burning wood is carbon neutral, ignoring the fact that huge amounts of CO2 is coming out of the smokestack, because this is this is sort of land use change just can be magically ignored. Deforestation doesn't count, it's CO2 neutral. Another thing that's often ignored is methane leaks, which applies to a range of uses of fossil fuels, because we think about fossil gas being burnt, creating carbon dioxide. It's a greenhouse gas and a big problem. But often the fossil gas leaks out itself, and methane is a really powerful greenhouse gas. So calculations for to say that they're around blue hydrogen, and you might remember around fracking, around even the Cumbria coal mine, because that involves methane emissions. This is not taken into account sufficiently, and once you do, you get some really scary results that say that these technologies are not anywhere like nearly as green as they're claimed to be. So that's all taking things off the balance sheet and ignoring them. One more special mention, it's not related to energy, which is the main thing we're talking about, but I am particularly not a fan of the claims for net zero airport, which is a very popular thing nowadays. You don't count the emissions from the flights, that's how you get a net zero airport. Second thing, offsetting. Not going to talk about this much, but it's basically a scam. So sometimes you get funding for good stuff. Really, we should be funding that anyway. If it's funded by the carbon offsets, then, well, the good stuff is offset by the bad stuff, so you don't have a net benefit. And often the projects don't do what they're supposed to do. There's been a lot of exposés of this recently. I'm just going to do a slide with some recent headlines. These are all recent stuff. It's basically becoming a lot clearer that carbon offsetting really is not a solution to climate change. The third thing is what I've called techno-optimism. So in talking about technologies, just sort of gloss over the fact that they're not developed, they haven't been proved at scale. Carbon capture and storage, which I won't talk about now because Ellen's going to go into that much more detail, is a great example of that. Also treating things like you can scale them up without problems. Well, we had one plane fly with one person in on cooking oil. That means that we can all go on flying as much as we want. And the whole hydrogen industry ignores the scale of what would be needed if all the things that have been suggested as uses for hydrogen were put into place. Even to replace the hydrogen we use now would need twice the renewable energy that we're producing in the whole world. So again, not being realistic about what's required to scale up these technologies. And another element of techno-optimism, less related to climate change, is just to ignore some of the, or try and gloss over some of the risks that may be involved in things like transporting CO2. If a CO2 pipeline leaks, that's actually really nasty. And the idea of this becoming a very widespread technology does raise concerns. Also, how whether long-term storage is really possible. And finally, the lobbying and PR machine, and this is something which will be found in local communities. It will be found in Parliament, in national governments, and right up to huge concerns about the coming UN climate talks, COP28, and their capture by fossil fuel industries. And one of the big problems is that greenwash technologies displace solutions that really work. And I've got a couple of headlines there about the backtracking on allowing more onshore wind in England. That's, I think, the cheapest renewable technology around, and it's being completely blocked. And the complete failure to insulate homes. And those are just two examples, as the recent report from the Climate Change Committee showed, of how solutions that we do have are not being put in place. And then you get the big subsidies being diverted to these technologies. So big investment in carbon capture and storage. And of course, we're going to hear some more later about the subsidies, renewable subsidies to Drax Power Station. So more detail from others later, but I hope that gives a good overview. Thanks.
Great stuff, Claire. Thank you. And you beat me to it on the airport thing, because I was going to mention that the ludicrousness of airport expansion, not including all the flights that you're actually expanding to accommodate, is just bizarre example. Okay, let's turn to Ellen Robottom. Ellen's the secretary of the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group, also one of the co-authors of the Climate Jobs booklet, specifically the Energy and Buildings chapter, and a campaigner in the Leeds area on a whole range of issues. So, Ellen, go ahead.
Thanks, Tahir. Just get onto my. Oh, come on. Right. So really just going into a little bit more detail about what Claire's already described to begin with. A little bit more about carbon capture and storage. So there are basically three approaches to carbon capture and storage currently. And the one that you hear about most of the time is the one that's usually the one that is being proposed for use in fossil fuel-based power stations, so for electricity generation, and that's post-combustion carbon capture, which separates the carbon capture from the separates the carbon dioxide from the flue gas from the exhaust of a combustion process. That the second category is similar to this, except that the fuel is burnt in a nearly pure oxygen environment. That results in a more concentrated stream of carbon dioxide emissions, which is easier to capture. But essentially, it's the same process. And then there is pre-combustion carbon capture, which is where the fuel can be gasified and separated. The carbon dioxide is separated out initially. That's primarily for industrial processes, but it would be very difficult to retrofit onto existing plants. So would only currently be proposed for brand new installations. And then what happens after that is that the carbon dioxide is compressed to what's called a supercritical state, which is where it's still a gas, but it behaves like a liquid. And it's piped, usually through underground pipes, but also maybe transported in specialist vehicles to underground storage, which may be in spent oil and gas fields or coal mines, and maybe in saline aquifers, which are areas usually under the ocean bed. There are both of these are being proposed to be used in this country. And there are some problems with that, which I'll just touch on. So just to describe how this policy that's based on carbon capture is being proposed, expected to be rolled out in this country. So about 50% of the high emissions industries in this country fall into one of 6 clusters. About 50% of them are scattered around the rest of the UK, but a high proportion of high emissions industries are in very concentrated areas, and so those areas are proposed to become low carbon clusters based on carbon capture. And the first 2 have already been named for government support, which is the East Coast Cluster, which comprises so-called zero carbon Humber and net zero Teesside together, and then HyNet in the Northwest and North Wales, which we're going to be hearing more about later on in the meeting. So I'll just briefly say the East Coast Cluster. The statements here are taken from the East Coast Cluster website. So the cluster is based around carbon dioxide pipelines and shared storage under the southern North Sea in what's called the Northern Endurance Aquifer. And the claims that are made for this are that it's going to support levelling up by creating loads and loads of jobs, 25,000 jobs a year to 2050 is the claim. And it is very much a claim. There's very, very little to substantiate it. And that it's going to kickstart this so-called hydrogen economy, supporting the creation of so-called low-carbon hydrogen projects to deliver 70% of the UK's hydrogen target. Now, the UK's hydrogen target it doesn't specify the amounts of blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, which Claire described a few minutes ago. Blue hydrogen being based on fossil fuels, with the emissions captured, green hydrogen being created by putting electrical currents through water. But the government policy doesn't actually specify how much of each of those are going to be part of the hydrogen target. But what we do know is that these clusters, the East Coast Cluster is based very, very heavily on production of blue hydrogen. And the blue hydrogen, then that then is expected to feed into other heavy industries that require that normally use fossil fuels as a feedstock. So just going on to the does carbon capture and storage work? Well, it's always spoken about as if it was a thing, as if it was already a thing. It exists, it's been used for decades, it works, there's no question about it. And yes, it has been used for decades, but not to sequester carbon dioxide, actually. So it does work on paper. The chemical process that separates the carbon dioxide from the flue gas, for example, does work. It works in theory, it works in the lab. In practice, at a plant-wide scale and in real-world conditions over longer periods of time, it's never been demonstrated at anything like the efficiencies that would be required for it to be a realistic kind of way of getting emissions down to near zero. So all the plant scale trials of carbon capture and storage, certainly in the power generation sector, have been, it's just been one technological issue after another, constant outages, having to be closed down for maintenance. So none of them has performed anywhere close to the nameplate efficiency. Often what's on the nameplate is a carbon dioxide capture rate of 90%. But you're not seeing that because a lot of the time it won't be operating at all. So you'll be burning fossil fuels with no carbon capture happening, or it just won't be working with the efficiency that it's supposed to do. There is only one currently operating power station in the world which is based on fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage, and that's Boundary Dam in Canada. It's a coal-fired power station. It's the only one that's actually currently working. So, you know, when we talk about this technology exists and it's happening, actually it isn't. It averaged a capture rate of about 50% up to 2021, 50% as compared with 90% or 95%, which are the claims that are being made. And it's quite difficult to get this actual these actual figures, but based on what you can extract from the website of this company, the best ever performance that they've ever had up to now, or at least the up to 2021, which is what I've been able to find, was a reduction in emissions intensity of burning coal of around 65%. So that means 65% less emissions per unit of electricity generated, which obviously isn't good enough at all. And it's worth noting there that because carbon capture and storage itself has a very high energy demand, so if it's being powered by fossil fuels, then you're using about 30% more fossil fuels to run the power plant than you would be without the carbon capture and storage. So as Claire already explained, the total amount of greenhouse gases can actually be greater by adding carbon capture and storage, because you're adding in the methane emissions, which are very much more potent greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide if measured over 20 years rather than 100. And of course the 20 years are actually the critical time. I see the time starting to run out. There's just a little bit here about the use of carbon capture and storage in industry. I mean, one of the key industries that it's being touted for is the steel industry, which is absolutely critical because it's a very, very high emitting industry at the moment, and a very, very critical industry for building out the renewables that we need, such as wind turbines. Lobbyists are arguing that carbon capture is the best solution for capturing the carbon dioxide that's emitted in the process of reducing the iron ore using coke, and from the reaction with oxygen that's used to remove the excess carbon to produce the good quality steel. Greener methods include direct reduction using green hydrogen, not blue hydrogen, for the reasons that we've just spoken about. Probably hear a bit more about that also. And also recycling scrap steel, because currently the UK exports 80% of its scrap steel, and that could be recycled. So we may hear more about that later in the meeting, but I'll just go quickly on to what Claire's already covered, really, that historically gas processing has been the main use for carbon capture and storage. Initially it was simply vented into the air, but then it found a profitable use in enhanced oil recovery, which is where it's pumped into oil wells that are almost spent to make it possible to get the oil out more easily. And as Claire's already described, when oil and gas are described as carbon neutral, or even coal is described as carbon neutral, which is really being spoken about in relation to the proposed coal mine in Cumbria, what they're actually talking about is the emissions associated with extracting and processing the material, not the emissions from burning the coal, the gas, the oil, whatever. I think we will be hearing more about the negative emissions technologies in relation to BECCS, so I'll just skip that one and use my last couple of minutes to talk about what I've described as jobs wash. I'm going to coin that phrase, jobs wash. So greenwashing of fossil fuel technologies poses a real threat to workers and their communities. And really what the industry is trying to claim is the opposite. They're trying to claim that that a just transition to genuine renewables poses a threat to workers and poses a threat to jobs. But the reality is the exact opposite, because what's actually going to happen is that this transition does need to happen. The fossil fuels do need to stop. And if we don't have a planned and fair worker-led transition, then that's when the jobs are eventually going to fall off a cliff edge. And that is the threat that is really being faced by workers in those high emissions industries. And this becomes clearer when you actually look at the technologies and the developments that are being foregone, because the investment in green technologies and the millions of jobs that are actually needed to cut energy demand in buildings, transport, manufacture and food growing, all of this means foregone investment in good, sustainable employment. So, you know, rather than thinking about the jobs that are threatened by phasing out fossil fuels, of course, we do need to phase them out, and we need to phase them out in such a way that all of those workers are guaranteed a supported transition into good, well-paying jobs. But really, where we're in danger of losing these millions of jobs is if we don't get the investment, if we don't get the attention to the actual sustainable jobs, the genuine renewables and all the other jobs that we need to cut that energy demand. So I've just ended this up by a little bit being a little bit sarcastic about this. This would be the advice that will be given to the fossil fuel and the biomass industry, how to persuade people that fossil fuels and biomass are the best thing for jobs, and that's what we need. Hugely exaggerate the number of jobs to be created, as Claire's already mentioned. Talk about the jobs numbers at the peak of the construction period. That's a really key one. Like Drax is talking about creating 10,000 jobs by adding carbon capture to its burners. That 10,000 jobs actually in the longer term becomes 375 direct jobs. The rest of them, if I go on to the next bullet point, a lot of the jobs that it talks about are indirect and induced jobs. Now, induced jobs are just like the jobs in the wider economy that are created when workers have more money in their pockets, essentially. So they buy more stuff. And obviously those jobs can be created by any sort of investment in the local economy. They can be they are spin-offs from any jobs at all, but they're spoken about as if only this industry can create those indirect and induced jobs. Argue that other industries are dependent on your project. And again, this is what Drax is doing. If there's no Drax, there'll be no carbon capture, so no blue hydrogen, so no foundation industries. So it won't just be the jobs at Drax that we won't have, it'll be the jobs all across the East Coast cluster that we won't have. Just absolute nonsense. And then what Claire's already mentioned, that talk about it as if the technologies already exist when they don't. And then really just to summarise, don't, whatever you do, give any comparison scenarios, because if you talk about the other things that these vast amounts of public investment could be going into, well, people might start to think that we could use this public money to build out genuinely renewable energy systems, that we could retrofit homes so that people don't have to freeze in the winter. We could improve public transport so that it's accessible and everybody has access to it, and that we don't need to use cars. We could grow our food sustainably. We could do all the that we could do our land work in a way that actually sequesters more carbon rather than wrecking the soil and wrecking the land. And of course, what you then have to do is to capture the discussion politically, by lobbying MPs, but also very much in the communities to get into schools, to get into colleges, to get into community events, and make sure that people understand that these high emitting industries are with their carbon capture, that of course is plentiful, that this is the only way for them to have local jobs, and that it's not possible in any way to have local jobs doing stuff that's actually useful and that actually works. Okay, I think I'm sorry I've gone a bit over time, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ellen. Excellent. And thank you as well for pointing out that the real cliff edge is when we can't do fossil fuels anymore, not the cliff edge that has been mentioned about what if we can't stop doing new oil and gas. I mean, we need to get the right cliff edge really to actually protect workers in the long term. Okay, are you going to, I'd imagine you're trying to come out of share screen, because I think next speaker. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just
that's okay.
to do that. There we are.
Okay, so our next speaker then is Don Naylor, and Don is engaged in a campaign against the greenwash put out by HyNet, which Ellen has just mentioned, a project in the northwest that's purporting to unlock a low carbon future through hydrogen, but Don will no doubt give us the real picture there. So please go ahead, Don.
Yep, thanks, Stuart. I'm just trying to get into screen share mode myself. Okay. Slightly less competent in this department. Okay, is that coming up?
Yeah, we're not seeing it, Don.
You're not seeing it, right? Okay.
Is
anyone
anyone else
to help out, like Claire, for example? That would be wonderful. Meanwhile, I will.
If you just, if Claire can get the slides up, you can just tell her when to flip from one slide to another.
Yeah, that would be really handy, and I apologise for my slight incompetence.
There we go.
We're good to go. Right. Okay. Thank you, Claire. Right. So HyNet Greenwash, the unofficial alternative name to HyNet, alternative name sometimes also known as HyNot. Who are we? We're a very loose collective in the northwest of England, North Wales, basically including people like some fantastic residents of the Whitby district of Ellesmere Port that you'll hear more about shortly. Experienced anti-fracking campaigners, people who've been here before and seen off the corporate hype. Green Party members, Friends of the Earth, Extinction Rebellion, an amazing campaign group based in Italy called Recommon, and more of them in a moment. And we even got direct links with Friends of the Earth NGO in Mozambique, and I'll explain the relevance of that again shortly. Claire, if you, sorry, that I know we're not quite there yet, are we? No. So this first slide, by and large, it's lifted from HyNet's own webpage. So a map of the Northwest that you probably recognise, but if you don't, it's basically you got Liverpool, Manchester area, the Wirral Peninsula, which is the bit between the two rivers, the Mersey and the Dee, and the section of North Wales as well. The two references to jobs are HyNet's own expectations, as they would have the public believe, and a sort of similar kind of approach to the Greenwash that Alan was mentioning just previously. And then we've got the kind of the network map of the various pipelines. Blue is essentially hydrogen, and the red is CO2. Exiting the proposal is via a pipeline running along North Wales and entering the Irish Sea in Liverpool Bay. That again is my highlighting the green cloud around what looks like an oil rig. Explain in a moment again exactly what's going on there, but basically the proposal is to feed CO2 from blue hydrogen production and existing heavy industry in places like Stanlow and pump it out under the sea where it will stay forever. The other thing I've highlighted there is in the key right-hand side towards the bottom, emphasizing the word homes, that there still seems to be some expectation on HyNet's behalf that domestic heating will be part of what hydrogen is going to be able to deliver for society. Anyway, Claire, if you don't mind, can we go to the second one, and I'll just concede defeat. Thank you. Okay, so I guess a lot of people here may recognize a lot of the usual suspects there. Again, this is a page without the red circles, but the on the left there is a listing from HyNet's own website about some of their key partners. These partners change. One or two have kind of were there early on and then have dropped out. Generally, the numbers keep increasing, but however the shuffle is, the ones that always appear first are ENI, NE, and SR, which essentially are just global level fossil fuel companies. NE is based in Italy, SR by and large based in India, but they both operate in the UK increasingly so. NE's been in the news very recently. You may have your own preferences for the bad guys within those others listed. I just singled out Unilever, Cargill, both embroiled in global south deforestations via production of palm oil and soya that variously comes to the UK and elsewhere, and Cadent Gas. Cadent Gas, very, very involved in the Whitby hydrogen village extravaganza that I'll move on to next. Claire, if you don't mind clicking the next slide, please, it'd be brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so in the background there, before I move on to the text, that is a photo taken by a neighbour of mine who's got a much bigger telephoto lens on her camera than I have. That is the current oil and gas extraction rig based out in Liverpool Bay, part of the Irish Sea. It's about 12-15 miles off the North Wales coast, similar distance from Wirral, and fairly often they give themselves away, as they did on May the 17th, and burning off, because UK law enables them to do this, some kind of unwanted fossil fuel that they're going to either shove down the pipe into North Wales or into one of the waiting tankers. So just bear that in mind, because any are central to the whole HyNet partnership proposal. Whitby Hydrogen Village, right, really doesn't deserve to be put in square brackets. This in some ways is a good news story. So previously, Cadent, British Gas, very much in cahoots with the local council, Cheshire West and Chester, decided amongst themselves that Whitby, which is part of Ellesmere Port, would be an excellent place to try out a hydrogen village, i.e. switch from natural gas cooking and heating in a domestic situation to some kind of substitute with a hydrogen mix. Didn't bother mentioning this to the 2,000 households there. So quite understandably, when the residents got the wind that they were going to be used as guinea pigs, they were very unhappy about this. I mean, this is something that the HyNet Greenwash group, by leafleting those 2,000 households, kind of triggered an awareness, because no one else had amongst those residents. But I think due recognition must be given that once these residents realised that they were being used in this experiment, they were more than capable of running their own campaign via national and regional media. So I mean, it went to such in such a direction, it has essentially changed the political landscape locally. At the time of the local elections, one Labour councillor lost their seat and was supplanted by a Green, and in the other half of Whitby, almost the same thing happened. The local MP and the Labour-led council has kind of belatedly recognised that they made too many assumptions here, and you really shouldn't be designing domestic heating networks without involving the people involved from the outset. Okay, back to the slide. So I mentioned the Italian campaign group Recommon. Recommon, this again was national headlines early May time, a bit along the same lines that Shell and BP have been taken to court, saying you've known full well for 50 years that your business as usual model, and the continuation of that is going to be a kind of fundamental driver of climate change. The same thing now has happened in Italy. It's the first time that a climate lawsuit has been taken out in a court in Italy, and the campaign group Recommon, find them on Twitter, find them on Facebook. They post a fair amount in English, mostly Italian, obviously, but they along with Greenpeace Italy and 12 Italian citizens have essentially taken out this case against Eni in Rome. Other aspects that have arisen from that is that Recommon again have they are a very effective shareholder activist group. They have shares in Eni, which allows them to get questions submitted at the AGM. Very helpfully, they facilitated ourselves, the HyNet Greenwash group, to submit written questions 2 years running now, and some of those answers that we got back from ENI there were some greenwashy ones, but there were also some interesting ones. And mentioned there, the last bullet point is that it's now in writing that Eni are quite clear that at the end of the period of time where they're injecting CO2 into the bedrock under Liverpool Bay, how long will they watch it for? Answer is 20 years. They will monitor for leaks, and then they walk away, and it's hoped that the UK government would appoint someone else to monitor it forever after that. Okay, next slide, if you don't mind, Claire, please. Thank you. Right, so just focusing a little more on some of the Q&As at Eni's AGM. For example, we asked them, were they aware that increasingly in the UK, various universities are banning fossil fuel companies, such as themselves, from recruitment fairs, and therefore wouldn't that be a problem for them finding people to fulfill all these jobs for the pipeline and beyond? And the kind of deflecting answer was that no, they didn't expect that would be problematical. So where does that take us? Does that mean that they wouldn't expect to be recruiting locally, or does it mean that they wouldn't be recruiting sort of high-level skill jobs that you might expect graduates to be needed to fill? So we've kind of heard this stuff before. It was very much kind of one of the big reveals when we started digging behind the headlines with fracking. A couple of cards that we're playing right now, and we've had one meeting with a concerned member of the Welsh Parliament, having begin to have conversations about the specifics that Wales has that the rest of the UK doesn't. Wales, for example, has a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and it is also a core member of something called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is a kind of it's an alliance of nations that very much understands that we have to kind of, yes, we absolutely have to get away from a fossil-based lifestyle and normalized business model. So the questions that we kind of asked, well, we did ask to Eni's AGM, but they really didn't get the question, or they pretended that they didn't get the question, is if you as a fossil corporate, despite pretending that you're going to be part of the solution by sucking this nasty CO2 away and hiding it under the Irish Sea, how if you properly understand and set the context of your global operations against these laws and partnerships that the Welsh government is involved with, can you really be said to be a fit for purpose partner? We think that you're not, and it's going to be interesting. We haven't kind of gone all the way with this yet. What will the Welsh government and people like the Office of the Commissioner of the Wellbeing of Future Generations. Commissioner, how will they interpret having this global fossil corporate within their own backyard, pretending that they are a solution provider rather than a fundamental creator of the problem in the first place? Okay, so just quickly skipping on to the last few bullet points there. A concerning flip side to universities. I'm not talking just students, I'm talking like the universities themselves waking up to the fact they don't want fossil corporates in their campuses, is that we know that the messaging from HyNet, the glossy messaging, the greenwashing messaging, is being taken into some schools. So this is quite concerning. Some councils regionally are onto that, but it's kind of quite hard to make sure it doesn't happen, because approaches may often be made directly to schools rather than through a local authority. And of course, they won't present the downside to their glossy greenwashing message to the 9 and 10-year-olds. They won't say, oh, by the way, we're not checking for leaks for more than 20 years or probably ever at all. So that's something that really ideally needs to be addressed. Another council that seems to be waking up to its own concerns about this is Wirral Council. And then another headline in the news 10 days ago, I think it was, that really drives home exactly what a wolf in sheep's clothing any are, is the fact that they bought out Neptune Gas, which is the major gas producer in the North Sea. So Eni really becoming a clean energy partner of HyNet, scarcely believable, particularly when we look at the rest of your expanding fossil fuel portfolio. Last slide, please, Claire. Thank you. Okay, probably a couple of links there that some of you may already have seen, especially CAC2 core members. Hope within a couple of reports that Friends of the Earth Scotland, just to emphasise, Friends of the Earth Scotland is a slightly different entity than Friends of the Earth in the rest of the UK, as in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Friends of the Earth Scotland very much have a focus on the problematical side of carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, as has been discussed variously already this evening. And there's this amazing report in that first link where in partnership with other community groups and trade unions have produced this report, Our Power Offshore Workers' Demands for Just Transition. So really that is the complete antithesis of the greenwash that the corporates will put out there. Is we do need to transition rather than pretending that these false solutions are going to take us somewhere that they won't. And finally, before I forget, and I know there's at least one other person on this call, if you are interested in some background reading related to the HyNet Greenwash group, I can only very highly recommend have a look at the link tree there. Nothing to do with me. That's why it's a very concise encyclopedia of relevant background knowledge. Oh, and last thing, in the Scotland FOE hydrogen link, do watch the video. There's a fun video, well, fun in inverted commas video. The only thing there that may not be directly relevant to HyNet that is mentioned in the video is as Alan mentioned earlier, is using CO2 to force out the kind of last dregs of the fossil fuels. Eni tell us they're not doing that under the RSC, and of course we believe them, don't we? Okay, sorry about the slight shambles. That's me done for the moment.
Great stuff. Thank you, Don. Really appreciate it. And I'm not even going to ask you what Heineken's role in HyNet is. Okay, so thank you for that. We had scheduled a fourth speaker, Stuart Boothman from Stop Burning Trees. He's unable to be here because of traffic issues. Ellen, are you going to pick this up and just give us we do want to leave a bit of time for people to make comments and things. So is it possible to get Stuart's slides up and just take us through the main points about the Drax struggle, just in a few minutes?
We have got some other people from the campaign on the call, and I've just forwarded them Stuart's slides. So I'm not sure who wants to take that on, but
yeah, there's so many people. I'd need to see a hand raised to get an idea.
Is it Katy that was going to speak? Or
yeah, we were just trying to work out who's best placed to take over from Stuart. So yeah, I can give it a go.
Go ahead, Katy, it'll be fine.
I think, right, where are the slides? Do you have the slides, Claire?
Yeah, I can do my screen sharing again. Hang on. Let me just. Okay.
Okay, so this is quite a good stepwise illustration of what Drax is up to. So Stuart prepared these slides. He's part of Just Transition Wakefield, which is part of the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, which was set up with mainly groups in the north of England who challenged Drax, but people from around the country and in fact around the world are involved and invited to be involved. So Stuart's presentation had quite a focus on sort of just transition and environmental justice aspects of what Drax is up to. It all ties in. I mean, they're getting away with what they're getting away with because of their greenwashing, and the impacts on people are, you know, terrible. Do you want to go onto the next slide? Yeah, so the places where Drax sources the wood pellets that it burns, Drax being the biggest tree burner in the UK and also the biggest carbon emitter in the UK. After it converted from coal to biomass, they started burning wood pellets and received renewable energy subsidies. The majority of the wood pellets they burn are sourced from the United States, and the majority of the pellet mills that process the wood are sited in what are called environmental justice communities, which are communities where the majority are poor and non-white. Do you want to go on to the next slide? You can see here like the proximity of this pellet mill to where these people are living, and the people who live in these places experience just absolutely horrendous health impacts. They can't breathe, they have to wear masks, they have to clean their cars every single day because of the dust, and they're on oxygen, and it's causing all kinds of other diseases and illness, cancer, heart problems, like the impacts of wood dust. I think because it comes from wood, it's not really been anticipated that it's novel, this amount of wood dust in such a proximity to where people live. Can you go on to the next slide? And yeah, as you can see, these are people from a community standing up. There is a lot of resistance in these areas, but yeah, it's it's environmental racism because it's disproportionately impacting on Black people, and this idea of sacrifice zones where there's people who can just be sort of discounted, discarded, their lives don't matter. And I think this photo is Dogwood Alliance, which is a group in the US that campaigns against wood pellet production. And the next slide. Over here, they're making, I think Ellen's already covered this a bit, like these really inflated jobs claims. They are a big employer, and we do need to find a just transition for the workers at Drax. But you can only see how Drax really feels about the workers in terms of the responses to their employment. So recently there've been a number of wildcat strikes in response to pay and conditions, and in the process of that, Drax workers have started to speak out about the conditions inside Drax and the impact of the wood dust. Drax were due to be appear at Crown Court. They were taken to court by the Health and Safety Executive. We don't know the full details, but it was to do with wood dust exposure. The case has been dropped, but there was obviously a case to begin with. In the planning application for BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is basically carbon capture, but use it with biomass, which Drax claims is carbon neutral, therefore claim that BECCS is carbon negative. So burning trees and then sucking up the carbon and storing it underground is now being put forward as a major climate solution, which is clearly bonkers, but politicians are believing it, and now this is being factored into our climate policies and projections, that we don't need to cut emissions now because we can rely on BECCS to mop those emissions up later. Drax has put in a planning application for that. In that, they've done a jobs report with massively inflated jobs figures. These are the construction jobs, which there'll be a massive tailing off. And also a lot of the people at Drax aren't directly employed, so they're on not as good contracts as the workers who are at Drax. Ellen, if you want to expand on that, please do, because you're really the expert in this area. If you want to go on to the next slide. Yeah, this is just an example of Drax's greenwashing. It would take a whole talk to talk about all they do, but they're offering courses in the local college. People can come in and look around, and it's an educational experience for kids. They have loads of adverts in the local paper, which is known affectionately as the Drax Times instead of the Selby Times. I just constantly just kind of trying to make themselves seem like the good guys. They've got a Friends of Drax mailing list. They actually have this thing where you can sign up to a BECCS pledge, the same as like campaign organizations would, pledge your commitment to fighting climate change. They have pledge your support for BECCS. Recently they sponsored the Yorkshire Nature Fair. That was challenged, and eventually their visible sponsorship was dropped, and when the groups found out what Drax was up to, they don't want to be associated with them. They've been sponsoring York Pride, and we're taking action to stop burning trees on that, writing to them to ask York Pride to drop Drax. I don't know what the next slide is. Resources. Oh yeah, and this, yeah. So sorry that Stuart's not been able to make it. Apparently he's okay. He's got transport problems, but yeah, just really want to big up Just Transition Wakefield's contribution to the Stop Burning Trees coalition and their input on opposing Drax's planning application for BECCS, and really bringing in the jobs angle, because it is really pitched as this fight between jobs versus greenies, but actually the green solutions are much better in terms of providing employment, and probably nicer working conditions than working in a hot power station, breathing in wood dust. And yeah, any sort of joining up of the dots between those things is great. So please do get involved in what we're doing and work out how what you're doing can link with our campaign. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That's brilliant, especially given that you had to do it ad hoc as well. It's incredibly insidious as well when I see that stuff like Drax in the classroom and that, as if that's just a normal, acceptable thing. I'm just amazed, really. Okay, we have a little time for people to make comments or ask questions. I see one hand up. Anybody else wants to, please raise an electronic hand, because there's so many people at the meeting. So let's take Linda first.
I noticed in Claire's slides there was a mention that carbon capture and storage might be a temporary solution for the cement industry. So do any of the speakers know about the Peak cluster, a plan to do carbon capture and storage for the cement industry in the High Peak? We're due to hear some of them speak next Monday at a Hope Valley Climate Action meeting, and it will be great to know what we should be asking them to find out whether there is any sense in it at all, and how long will it take to create it, because apparently the Hope Valley Cement Works is only allowed to operate until 2042. So will the carbon capture and storage be underway in time for it to be significant?
Thanks, Linda. Richard?
Do you want me to come in on that one? Or
Well, let's take the questions first, and then if you jot them down, I'll bring you in at the end. Richard Hebert.
Sorry, just trying to unmute. I'm just wondering, listening to Don's report and the tactics used, particularly in AGMs and with councils and universities, and given that the government is just boycott divestment in relation to protests, whether there's any vibe that anybody's picking up that there's a possibility that, given the government's the benefit the government derives from the sponsorship of companies involved in these sort of activities, whether there is a possibility that similar legislation might be enacted against the sort of activism that Don's been talking to us about. Thank you.
Yeah, no doubt. Angela.
Hi, can everyone hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Champion. I think the presentations were really excellent, and not to say that while Friends of the Earth Scotland have been doing really good work, it's not all rosy up here in terms of, we still have, from my perspective, HyNet, my union, although I have been working closely with one of the offshore branches, so by and large, you know, they've said as well, and they've highlighted that the failings in the Scottish government, the failings in, you know, sort of the political system. So everyone talks a good game, you know, COP26 in Glasgow, the Scottish government have reneged several times on different, you know, green commitments, and just that, you know, that you know, that is a failing. It's maybe also to encourage everyone, you know, in their own trade unions who are, you know, pay into the political fund, to please be involved in that, because that's where, for example, you know, I mean, the Labour Party in Scotland, for goodness sake, isn't actually much better than the SNP. You know, they're saying that they will honour any existing commitments to oil and gas licenses. So basically, if it's had to go ahead before next year and they haven't started, they're going to let that go ahead. So it was just mainly to encourage people, but it's not all rosy. And in terms of no, in fact, no, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Angela. And Les.
Okay, yeah, thanks for all the excellent talks. For the HyNot campaign, I'd like to ask, what arguments did you initially emphasize to try to organize opposition against HyNet, and which arguments seem to be most successful, resonating with people? And for the other two talks, for Ellen and Claire, I'd like to ask how you see the prospects, or even perhaps the reality, of getting a debate on those greenwashing strategies within the trade unions that now collude with them, right? Because I mean, you've raised excellent issues which have been widely debated in the scientific press and increasingly in the trade press, but perhaps not in trade unions, especially those that basically support the continuation of fossil fuels through the false solutions that you criticize. So how do you see a way to get a debate so those leaders who collude with the industry can at least be held accountable?
Thanks a lot, Les. Let's take Mel next.
Thanks. It's more of a quick comment, actually. So I'm part of a group called Lawyers Are Responsible. Lawyers Are Responsible. So we're looking at the law firms that are fossil fuel industry enablers. And thanks to Claire sending like the brilliant Campaign Against Climate Change greenwashing leaflet, there are loads of law firms that are kind of like promoting kind of CCS as, as a greenwashing solution as well. So they're kind of like part of the problem. We're kind of targeting Allen and Overy law firm, who claims to be like, leading in helping to develop kind of like promote CCS through its clients. I just wanted people to know that that's happening. So if you know of specific law firms, like, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll follow it up. Thanks.
Great stuff. Thank you, Mel. So time's pressing on. So let's take Cynthia, and then I'll come back to the speakers for some comments on those points that have been raised. Cynthia, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is following on from Les's. As someone not very familiar with trade union activities, because I was in a not active trade union before I joined HyNot community in retirement. And how do we get to understand or see what the policies of our trade union are? I think there's an anxiety about what we want to do and how that fits with the overarching activities of the trade union. And I don't understand really how the two link. Should I?
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. So let's come back to there's a couple of questions on trade unions there. So come back to those at the end. Shall we take the more technical questions? Don, did you want to come back on both Linda's point about cement and CCS and government sponsorship, whether that's going to lead to a wave of anti-activist legislation, or at least the latter of those 2 points anyway?
Yeah, okay. Well, as I understand it, the Peak District cement industry will be hoping, or HyNet will be hoping, that they will be tapped into the network. As I mentioned at the outset, that kind of indicative network map on the website, every time you look, it kind of changes. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if there's an extension further east. I think I just want to emphasize on that one that the CO2 that's been like sucked out through the pipelines and under the sea is like twofold. It's the product. It's a byproduct from the blue hydrogen production that Alan went into some depth on, but they're also going to great lengths, HyNet, to explain that they're the saviors of all these pre-existing heavy industries who've like woken up to the fact that their CO2 is going to have to go somewhere other than the atmosphere. So here we are, helpfully on your doorstep, providing the means to do that. And in theory, it's kind of believable, except I'd say there are two massive caveats there. Industries should be looking, as far as is practical, to decarbonize anyway, to not churn out the same level of CO2 anyway. And in some sectors, there are realistic means of doing that. And secondly, as we kind of touched on before, the believability of the technology and the ethics of this massive polluter being the means of providing the solution is like it's massively questionable. So timescale wise, HyNet, I'll say I think 2042 was mentioned as when it would be needed for the Peak District cement industry. HyNet will tell you, yeah, they'll be ready for that. They'll be ready in about 2 or 3 years. Let's wait and see. If I could very quickly to hear, do you want me to just quickly respond to where we think there might be kind of levers that we can successfully pull as campaigners? Shall I go there as well?
Yeah, do.
So the two that I've touched on that I think have been, one's already been successful, and we can't really take a massive amount of credit for it. The kind of awareness raising and total competence in running their own campaign of the Whitby would-be hydrogen villagers. Basically, the lesson to learn there is corporates and authorities can make these like fundamentally unfounded assumptions that what they think are solutions will be accepted by all. So it was quite heartening, and I think it was probably, because it was a domestic sector, it's probably like the most sensitive trigger point that could be pushed. If it's transport, if it's industry, then it may not be quite so emotive because you're not actually in people's homes. But a massive mistake, we feel, was made by the corporates and by their enablers. So in a sense that was good. A fight has been taken on, and it will probably be won. And then the other one, and I know this doesn't apply to the rest of the UK, we feel there's certainly leverage to kind of just check out with all interested parties whether some of the context and laws in Wales are going to be things that the corporates haven't fully comprehended. We know there's a risk there. We know at the end of the day, even if the Welsh government says, no, we're not going to support this, we don't want this, the UK government can overrule that. We know that. We've been told that by Welsh politicians, but there's absolutely no reason not to try these things, because we don't think the corporates have properly thought them through.
Okay, thank you, Don. Appreciate that. Ellen, I'll come to you. Maybe you'd like to comment on, how we win the debates in trade unions, because I know that's something we've been doing a lot of, or seeking to do a lot of in the last few months. I'll just point out as well that a couple of contributions in the chat from Clara, who's doing a lot of good work in HyNet, in actually trying to bring grassroots trade unionists to influence national policies and try and change some of those difficulties that we're having at the moment. But Ellen, did you want to say something on that, or indeed in response to any of the points?
Yeah, I've only just realised that Clara's actually in the room, but yeah, I'm looking. It's extremely difficult because, as Clara will tell you, we do have a climate justice caucus within HyNet, which has put forward 2 motions to next week's policy conference. One around democratic planning and the idea of workers' assemblies, but the other calling for no new fossil fuels. And what we're concerned about now is that that's going to be interpreted as stop fossil fuels now, throw the workers off that cliff edge. Of course, that's not what we're talking about. It's it'd be really, really, I mean, completely disingenuous for anybody to interpret it that way, because I think it's very clear that what that actually means is that is no more opening up of new oil and gas fields such as Rosebank and which we know are going to, you know, that would just blow any sort of carbon budget to smithereens. But yeah, this whole framing of climate activists as being, you know, anti-working class, anti-jobs, all the rest of it, it's so pernicious, and the only thing that I can see that we can really do is to try and be much more out there in terms of having those discussions at, you know, at the base of our unions, in branch meetings, in workplaces, and just really trying to get beyond the usual suspects. And I think it's exposing the falsity of the jobs arguments. I mean, if anybody, we've got the Cumbria coal mine people saying that they're going to create 500 direct jobs and 1,500 indirect jobs. Well, yeah, jobs that are incredibly fragile, because, you know, we know the thing isn't that there's no market for the thing. So, you know, people are being really sold down the river. People are being sold down the river at Drax by this idea there are 10,000 jobs going to be created, when the vast majority of those jobs are actually going to go once the construction period's over, if this happens. But it's picking those things apart that I think is really going to have the direct. It's not just for workers themselves, of course, because workers, it's the communities, that it's the wider economy within those communities that really kind of you know, carries either the support or the opposition. I think Dom's right to say that actually when people's homes are going to be directly affected, and then people are very much, you're not doing that to my, you know, you're not going to impose that on me. And plus it's dangerous, you know, hydrogen's explosive. Putting CO2 through pipelines that are designed for fossil fuels to go through is very dangerous, because the characteristics of the pipeline that are needed to prevent it from rupturing or leaking are very different, and this isn't being looked at properly. So I think one of the things that we've looked at is that where these companies are vulnerable is very much in when they've got things that are perceived as potentially dangerous and are potentially dangerous by communities, people in their homes, you know, people whose kids go to school near these pipelines or whatever. Yeah, and I just wanted to make a quick comment about the cement as well, because actually, you know, if carbon capture ever does work in the way that it's, or I won't say if it ever works, I will say if it becomes implemented, because that's a very different matter. It might become implemented even though it doesn't work. But there are alternative technologies to cement being developed. And, you know, it's one of those areas where retrofitting with carbon capture could be exactly the thing that impedes that development of better technologies. You know, the same as with the steel industry, except steel is further on in terms of being able to actually genuinely go green. It's more difficult with cement, but it'll happen if the research and development goes there. If we go down the carbon capture pathway, then it probably won't. Yeah, I think that's probably all I wanted to say just there.
No, thanks, and totally agree on carbon capture as well. I mean, what if you put your money into non-emitting technologies and materials, carbon capture will be redundant anyway. So it's a bit of a circular argument in that respect. But we've really got to demand that the money is put in the right place. Claire, did you want to say a few closing words before we wrap up?
I was just thinking in terms of next steps, for me, one of those would be to try and maybe pull the links into an email and send to people who've registered for this meeting. Also, I thought Clara's suggestion in the chat was interesting about trying to distill some of the key points from this meeting and into a presentation or simpler meeting that could be used, what she suggested with trade union branches, but obviously could be more widely applicable than that. So I think that might be the next challenge. And obviously, you know, do get in touch with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have relevant stuff or would like a speaker at a trade union branch or whatever.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of links and communications been posted in the chat as well, so do check them out. And Ellen, can I just ask you very quickly before we do close, because I was just thinking about upcoming stuff. There's an event, so I guess it's an in-person event at Sheffield next a week on Saturday or something like that.
And it's I mean, I get the impression that it's largely aimed at people in South Yorkshire, but I think that what they're really trying to do, very much focusing on the stuff we've been talking about today. But I think that what their aim is to really move it on from the, you know, why all this is wrong and what the better alternatives are, to really move it on to how can we really, you know, build the awareness of this across our workplaces and trade union branches, and you know, move it on to strategy and action, because I think that we have largely, I mean, I suppose think two different things about this, because when I've presented this information at meetings, I've thought, oh, I'm speaking to the converted, everybody knows this already, and it turns out that they don't. So it is very important to keep on you know, sharing the basic information, but also that to a great extent we have spread a lot of, you know, the ideas out there that it's not the carbon capture, it's not these techno fixes that we need, it's actually a different kind of reorganization of society and of the economy, that we need to reduce our energy demand, that we need to put literally millions of people to work doing that. But it's never going to happen, because we've got really, you know, we've got a government that is actually literally genocidal, and you know, even if there were a more progressive government, it wouldn't be enough. What are you going to do is kind of the thing. So it really is about moving it on to really getting boots on the ground and getting people organised around these things.
Yeah,
so yeah,
thanks.
Come to Sheffield if Sheffield isn't too far away. Come to Sheffield and carry on this discussion.